Not good enough. That was British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer's blunt message to Vladimir Putin. After months of brutal fighting, Putin finally offered a partial ceasefire, one that would halt Russian attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure but keep the war raging. But the UK isn't buying, because the UK knows the truth. Putin can't be trusted. Instead of backing down, the UK is doubling down, keeping the weapons and aid flowing to Ukraine no matter what the Kremlin demands. So why is the UK rejecting Putin's ceasefire? How is the UK shaping Ukraine's fight for survival, and what does this mean for the future of the war? Let's break it all down. It all started on March 19th. That's when reports began surfacing about the outcome of US President Donald Trump's much-anticipated phone call with Putin. According to Sky News, the call resulted in an agreement between Trump and Putin. There would be no immediate 30-day ceasefire to the war. That was disappointing for Zelensky, who'd negotiated the ceasefire terms with Trump mere days earlier. However, there seemed to be a light at the end of the tunnel. Putin said no to a full ceasefire, but he agreed with Trump that Russia would stop attacking Ukraine's energy infrastructure for 30 days. Ukraine mirrored that agreement and a partial ceasefire seemed to be in place. We say seemed because Putin would soon go back on his word, as we'll reveal later in the video. Putin also made further demands during his call with Trump. To have any chance of a full temporary ceasefire, never mind actual peace, Putin wants all of Ukraine's allies to stop sending military aid and intelligence to Zelensky's troops. That's as good as Putin saying he wants to demilitarize Ukraine. He knows that without its allies, Ukraine will struggle to hold off Russia's forces if and when Putin decides to invade again. Thankfully, the US didn't capitulate to that demand. Trump even went as far as to claim that military aid wasn't even discussed in the phone call. That's a direct contradiction to what the Kremlin claims, muddying the waters further. Is Trump telling the truth? Has Putin gone into business for himself by bringing the aid issue to the table after the call? We may never know. What we do know is that practically every European nation was watching and waiting to discover the call's outcome. The UK was one of those nations. One of Ukraine's staunchest supporters, the UK wanted to get the lay of the land before it made any decisions regarding the future of its work with Ukraine. By the time reports emerged about the call, the UK clearly had enough. As soon as it heard about Putin's demands that Ukraine's allies stop sending military aid, it shot a message right back to Russia's leader. No chance. That's according to Bloomberg. On March 19th, it reported that the UK had rejected all demands by Putin for Ukraine's allies to suspend their military aid during the partial ceasefire with Ukraine. Sir Keir Starmer made the UK's position clear. "We will always continue to support Ukraine militarily," Starmer's spokesperson Dave Paris told reporters in London after Trump's call with Putin. That support will apply in all scenarios, including any in which Ukraine and Russia achieve peace. To Starmer, refusing to send aid to Ukraine is tantamount to giving up on the entire country. UK's Prime Minister believes that Putin can't be trusted at his word. He sees Russia's call for the suspension of aid for what it really is, an attempt to weaken Ukraine so Russia has an advantage when hostilities restart. But that only gives us part of the reason why the UK has just said no to Putin. There's another, as The Independent highlighted on March 19th, disappointment. According to the British outlet, Starmer had already expressed his disappointment with what could be best described as Putin's lukewarm response to the initial ceasefire terms negotiated between Trump and Zelensky. That version of the 30-day ceasefire would have seen Ukraine and Russia lay down arms across every area of the battlefield. Ground forces would grind to a halt, aerial bombardments would stop, even attacks by and against the Black Sea Fleet, which is stationed in annexed Crimea, would end for 30 days. It would have been a true ceasefire that gave Russia and Ukraine a chance to recharge and potentially come to the table to continue further negotiations. Putin said no to that version of the ceasefire. Though Russia's leader claimed that he agreed with the principle behind the ceasefire, questions still needed to be answered. Speaking at a Moscow press conference, Russia's leader said, "The idea is right and we support it, but there are questions that we need to discuss." Putin also called for an enduring peace and removing the root causes of the crisis. Therein lay the problem for the UK. To the UK and most of Ukraine's Western allies, the root cause of the Ukraine war is simple. Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine in February 2022. It's all Russia's fault, and it's a war that wouldn't have happened at all if Putin didn't follow through on his expansionist desire. Putin sees his invasion much differently. To him, the root cause of the crisis is Ukraine's existence. Putin feels that Ukraine and Russia shouldn't be separate states. Instead, Ukraine is and always has been part of Russia, even though it's been an independent nation for decades since the fall of the Soviet Union. Russia's leader even claimed that Ukrainians and Russians are one people before he launched his invasion, which is telling. A ceasefire of any kind doesn't mean much when Putin is so concerned about the supposed root causes of the Ukraine issue. He doesn't recognize himself as that cause, and to solve the problem in his mind, there's only one path: dissolve Ukraine into the Russian Federation. That brings us back to the initial ceasefire proposal and UK's immediate reaction. The Independent notes that Starmer felt that Russia's refusal to accept terms was disappointing, and he said that Ukraine would always have the UK's unwavering support. Hours before Putin's phone call with Trump, that was a message to Russia's president. The UK knows what Putin really means when he claims that he wants to solve the root causes of the war. The UK's steadfast backing of Ukraine is as much a way to support Ukraine's right to exist as it is a declaration that it'll continue providing military aid to the invaded nation. Starmer made the UK's position even clearer in the immediate aftermath of Trump's call to Putin. We obviously welcome President Trump's efforts to secure a ceasefire in this space, but it's also disappointing that Putin has not agreed to a full-on, immediate ceasefire without conditions, as Ukraine has done, said Starmer's spokesperson. Starmer went a step further hours later. During Prime Minister's Questions, which is a block of time reserved weekly in which Parliament can directly question the Prime Minister, Starmer had a message. Last night I spoke to President Zelensky to discuss progress that President Trump had made with Russia towards a ceasefire, and I took the opportunity to reaffirm our unwavering support to the people of Ukraine. Again and again, the message is the same. It doesn't matter what Putin says. The UK stands by Ukraine because it knows that Putin's version of peace can only be achieved if Ukraine ceases to exist. The aid will keep flowing because Putin isn't serious about a true ceasefire in Starmer's mind. At best, Russia's leader wants to stall so he can regroup his forces. At worst, Putin's claims that he wants even a partial ceasefire are false. Zelensky will certainly be happy to have such a major ally outright reject Putin's calls for the end of military aid to Ukraine. Since Putin launched his invasion, the UK has delivered over $15.6 billion worth of aid to Ukraine. The majority of that comes in the form of military aid. Around $10 billion has been committed to weapons and intelligence sharing by the UK. Furthermore, the UK has also been active on the non-military aid front. It has sent $6.1 billion that Ukraine has used to repair damaged infrastructure and support its citizens as Russia's troops rampage through the country. The UK's support has even extended to the creation of what the government calls the UK-Ukraine 100-year partnership. This collaboration sets out UK's stall when it comes to Ukraine. It'll see the two nations collaborate across 9 pillars, which include defense, security, economy, trade, science, and technology. Signed in January 2025, the partnership is the UK's way of demonstrating that Ukraine has the right to exist and that the UK is doing everything that it can to guarantee a stronger Ukraine. There's also more British aid coming to Ukraine. In July 2024, the UK committed to sending $3.7 billion of military aid to Ukraine annually until the end of the 2030-31 financial year, for as long as it takes. In other words, for as long as Putin's forces are active in Ukraine, the UK will send that money each year. And if the invasion ends before the 2030-31 financial year, the UK will keep sending that aid until this deadline, enabling Ukraine to rebuild and restructure its military. Adding to this is a $2.94 billion loan the UK committed to Ukraine on March 1st. That loan is part of the Group of 7 or G7's Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration Loans for Ukraine scheme. And it's not really a loan at all. The UK essentially gives $2.94 billion to Ukraine under this scheme. Repayment is made not by Ukraine, but via the profits generated by the Russian assets that are currently frozen in the UK. In short, the UK is using Putin's own money against him to support Ukraine. No wonder Russia's leader wanted all of Ukraine's allies to stop sending aid. It gets worse for Putin. The UK isn't the only nation to display immediate skepticism about Russia's leader and his claims to want a ceasefire. Many of Ukraine's European allies were also quick to demonstrate that they don't believe a word Putin says in these ceasefire talks. According to The Guardian, German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius says, "Putin is playing a game here, and I'm sure that the American president won't be able to sit and watch for much longer." Pistorius also said that Ukraine's pledge to stop attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure amounted to basically nothing, because that infrastructure is now among Ukraine's best protected assets. As for Putin's call to end all military aid to Ukraine, Pistorius had a one-word response: unacceptable. So it's not just the UK that will continue supplying aid to Ukraine. With that single word, Germany appears to have committed to carrying on sending weapons and supplies to Zelensky's troops. Outgoing German Chancellor Olaf Scholz confirmed this stance, claiming that Ukraine can count on us in the wake of Putin's demands. Those comments were mirrored by French President Emmanuel Macron. Finland's President Alexander Stubb also rejected Putin's request for military aid to be suspended. Ukraine has an undeniable right to defend itself on its own and supported by its partners. This right cannot be restricted in any way, not now and not in the future. But do you know who did approach Russia's attempt at a ceasefire with less skepticism? Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning said, "The Chinese side has advocated resolving the crisis through dialogue and negotiation from the very beginning. We welcome all efforts toward a ceasefire and consider it a necessary step toward achieving peace. If that step involves permanently weakening Ukraine, then so be it. The UK may have spearheaded the refusals to suspend military aid to Ukraine, but it's clearly not alone. Most major European countries have also said they'll continue funding Ukraine's military. It's also worth pointing out that the US hasn't made any moves to suspend aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine. That aid, which was reinstituted in the wake of the US-Ukraine-Saudi Arabia meeting that led to the initial ceasefire proposal, is still flowing. This all tells us one thing. None of Ukraine's partners trusted Putin to keep his word, and they were right. Do you remember earlier in the video when we told you that Putin would go back on his word after negotiating this supposed ceasefire with Trump? Well, he did it almost immediately. Mere hours after Putin claimed that he would stop all attacks on energy infrastructure, air raid sirens were sounding throughout Ukraine. Russia's president launched a drone and missile strike against several regions in the country, including the city of Slavyansk. There, local power infrastructure was hit, leading to a partial blackout in the city. It is precisely such night attacks by Russia that destroy our energy systems, our infrastructure, the normal lives of Ukrainians, Zelensky said in the wake of the strikes. Today, Putin de facto rejected the proposal for a complete ceasefire. It will be right for the world to reject in response any attempts by Putin to drag out the war. Perhaps Putin could claim that the strike against Ukraine's energy infrastructure, which came around an hour after he ended his call with Trump, was pre-planned. It's not part of his ceasefire, Putin might claim. However, that would be nonsense. The Kremlin said that Putin gave an immediate order to halt all attacks on Ukrainian energy immediately after his call with Trump. Immediate doesn't mean when we feel like it. Drones and missiles attacking Slavyansk just proved what the UK knew all along. Putin can't be trusted. That's why the UK will continue supplying military aid to Ukraine. If Russia's president can go back on his word so quickly after claiming to agree a partial ceasefire, what will stop him from lying about never invading Ukraine again, only to do so once the flow of aid stops? Finnish Prime Minister Stubb was just as quick to condemn Putin's actions. As someone who'd mediate the ceasefire in Georgia in 2008, I can say this is a fairly typical Putin tactic, Stubb claimed after Russia's latest energy infrastructure strike. We have an aggressor who says he wants a ceasefire and peace, but refuses to commit. And I think yesterday's phone conversation between Trump and Putin was a step in the right direction, but we are now seeing the true face of Putin. Stubb's solution to the problem is the same as the UK's. Militarize Ukraine to its teeth. Putin just revealed himself to be a total liar, just as the UK predicted he would. There was no chance the UK would suspend military aid to Ukraine precisely because Starmer, along with many other Western leaders, had Putin figured out. What Russia's president says and what he does are rarely the same thing. So we come to a final question. What happens next? Well, we know for sure that British military aid is going to continue flowing into Ukraine, along with aid from the rest of Europe. But what about the frozen Russian assets we mentioned earlier? According to the UK government website, the UK holds $23.39 billion in Russian assets that have been frozen since Putin invaded Ukraine. We already know that the revenue generated from those assets is being used to fund Ukraine's war effort. Is it possible that the entire sum might be unfrozen and sent to Ukraine? Right now, that seems like a step too far for the UK. When asked during Prime Minister's questions if it was time to strengthen Ukraine's hand and punish Russia's aggression by releasing the assets, Starmer was cagey. On the wider question of the assets, look, it's complicated, but we're working with others to see what's possible, but it isn't straightforward. The holdup appears to be the legal ramifications that would arise from essentially taking one country's money and giving it to another. The UK, along with the G7, has gotten around this problem so far by only committing revenue earned from those assets to Ukraine. Sending all of those frozen assets, which amount to over $300 billion across the UK, Europe, and the US, would raise tricky legal questions that the UK isn't prepared to answer. As for Zelensky, he's already spoken to Trump in the wake of Putin's call. Ukraine's leader said the call was positive, very substantive, and with Trump relaying the details of Putin's proposed ceasefire. Ukraine agreed to halt attacks on Russia's energy infrastructure, including its oil refineries, as long as Putin held off on his own strikes. Trump also promised to help Ukraine by fulfilling Zelensky's request to provide more air defense batteries to guard against Russia's aerial threat. We have received signals from the United States that we are talking about the ceasefire on energy facilities, a halt on attacking energy infrastructure, and we are also talking about the civilian infrastructure facilities, Zelensky said after he spoke. There also seems to be potential for the US to take ownership of some of Ukraine's energy assets. We talked only about one power plant, which is under Russian occupation. Perhaps that gives us a hint about Ukraine's strategy going forward. Putin has already revealed that he was lying about halting Russia's attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure. However, if some of that infrastructure came under US ownership, whether temporary or permanent, it would give Russia's leader a lot more to think about. It's easy to approve a strike on a Ukrainian power plant, It's a lot harder to conduct that strike when the US owns that infrastructure. For now, only one thing is certain. Putin can't be trusted to follow through on his word. The UK understood that in the immediate aftermath of Putin's conversation with Trump. That's why it refused to stop sending military aid to Ukraine. Russia's leader proved the UK's skepticism right by launching an immediate assault on Ukraine's energy systems after the phone call. Zelensky, for his part, still seems hopeful that a partial ceasefire can be achieved. However, the reality is that Putin's goal, his solution to the root cause issue, will always be the end of democratic Ukraine. For as long as that remains Russia's goal, the UK and Ukraine's other allies will keep sending aid. But what do you think about this complicated situation? Is there any chance that Putin will actually keep his word on any proposed ceasefire? What is Ukraine's next step in fighting against Russia's invasion? How much does the UK reaffirming its support for Ukraine mean in the context of the war? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for all of the latest Ukraine war news. Now go and check out Putin Finally Betrays Trump, or click this other video instead.